Hey everyone, so I spent some time to build this Nvidia model, and so I'm going to go over, what I think about Nvidia, what I think about this GPU market, and where I see them in the future. So a good thing to keep in mind is that Nvidia, they started selling the first kind of graphics processing unit. They weren't the first to create it, but they were the first to really market and capitalize on this technology. And they are still the leader in this technology today. And that's very important because there's only one big rival in the GPU market, which is Advanced Micro Devices, AMD. So yeah, this is what Nvidia designs, these GPUs, and they sell them to a wide variety of markets. I can go over the markets that they sell to. So these are GPUs that sell to the gaming market, 3D designer market, AI data scientists, cloud-based visual computing, and these markets are all profiting off of these GPUs. So most recently, Nvidia has been really getting into artificial intelligence, AI when it comes to automotive development. They want to help develop driverless cars, and this is very important because this is a step for Nvidia to kind of lock in a future position and leadership of this market. Now, one of the great things we saw just this past year is that they had a 41% revenue growth, and that's huge, especially when it comes to Nvidia, who hasn't had that large of revenue growth I don't think ever. So this was mostly driven by a growth in GPU sales, which I'll go into. Another interesting point is that data center revenue has been growing, extremely well, 141% last year and 134% this year. So this shows that something's going on in that market, and that's what I'm also going to get into. They also have these partnerships with a lot of automotive companies, and this will kind of come to reality around 2020, and this is very important for Nvidia's next step as a company. My favorite point is that Nvidia's gross margin is 60%, and when you compare this to their arch nemesis rival AMD only has 34% gross margin. So, because of this difference, I just think Nvidia is so ahead of AMD already in terms of revenue that the gross profit is just the cherry on top. So, most of the revenue growth that we saw was because, AI deep learning training started to become more popular, and GPUs are very good for training artificial intelligence. Now, we also saw that the Nintendo Switch was released in March, so that's early 2017, and that has grown revenue a lot for another reportable segment. And then there's also a lot of cryptocurrency popularity, which boosted revenue definitely, and I'll go into that. One of my most interesting finds was that Tesla's cars, they use an autopilot system, and the newest one, the Autopilot 2.0, uses Nvidia's AI computing platform, and that's called Drive PX, and I'll also go into that. Now, one of the good changes is that Autopilot 1 used Mobileye technology. Autopilot 2 uses NVIDIA technology. And so this is going from Intel, who owns Mobileye, to NVIDIA. So that's good for NVIDIA. Now, NVIDIA started as, gaming-centric. Their graphics cards, process graphics. And so that's what their market is. But most recently, these GPUs are very efficient when it comes to computing algorithms, more efficient than CPUs, which is dominated by Intel. So, they're moving into this more spread out focus and not so gaming focused. They still will be gaming focused, but they're starting to pay attention to other markets. Now, one of the most important things for this is that the architecture that these GPUs are built on, there is a new architecture to be released this year. So they're planning to announce it probably after March. There isn't actually a release date for the announcement, but that's what everyone expects. After March, they're going to release the announcement that a new gaming GeForce series, a new gaming GPU series using this architecture, the Volta architecture, will be announced. So I think this is going to increase the GPU revenue the next year and the next few quarters. So we can see that data center revenue grew 133%, and largely this was due because this new Volta architecture was actually released in a data center GPU. And so the increase in sales from this GPU, I think, is a trend that will go into the next release of this architecture, which is the GeForce series, a gaming GPU. Now, I'm going to go into Nvidia's reportable segments. So this is their revenue segments that they actually report separately, and we can kind of see what revenue is really driving their growth. So first we have GPU, which I explained is gaming, designers, AI, and cloud-based visual computing, and this is a majority of Nvidia's revenue at 84%. So that's huge. And their year-over-year revenue growth for this segment is huge. Again, at 39% and 40%. So this GPU segment is very important, and I'm going to go into that further. Now, Tegra is more integrated computers into a single chip. So this includes the Drive PX system. This includes a lot of autonomous car computing that they're doing. And this also includes the system on chip that is integrated into the Switch console. So Nintendo Switch sold a record amount of units, and this contains Nvidia's hardware. And so because of that, we saw that Tegra grew an 86% revenue this last year. So that's awesome to see, but it's still a small portion of their total revenue. So I want to see Nvidia kind of increase their Tegra revenue just to maybe 20%. I think that would be a good number. Now, their other revenue is patent licensing revenue, IP licensing, OEM, and this is a small portion of the revenue. Now, the $264 million of revenue was from Intel, and that contract recently expired. So now they aren't getting that 200 million or so of revenue from Intel anymore. So these are their reportable revenue segments, their product segments, and this is very important because this is how I do my prediction for what I expect of them in the future. Another good thing to focus on is their debt. Nvidia has been taking out not that much debt and at low interest rates, so 2.2% and 3.2%. And that's much better when you compare it to AMD taking it at around 7%. So, that's one thing to focus on, which I'll talk about later. So now I'm going to go into the model. And what this model does is that it takes into account not all, but several years of history of the income statement, including the quarters. And then I take that information and I kind of predict a forward prediction of how much revenue they'll have and how much net income they'll have. And this is hard to do because it depends on how good your estimates are. So if one estimate for 1 year is off by a lot, all estimates after that are going to be off. So it could be very tricky to kind of estimate this accurately. And I'll kind of go into how I can estimate these with high confidence. So it starts here with several years. We see the revenue for 2017. Nvidia did really good, and they have a gross margin of 60%. So that's awesome to see. And I can kind of take this into account when I predict the next year. So the next year, I kind of estimate their revenue to grow by 39%, which is still really high. I estimate them to still keep a gross margin of around 60%. And then I also insert a 12% tax rate because this is what Nvidia estimated that they would have. So 13.5 billion revenue, that's a lot for Nvidia. And that's a very bullish estimate. And so this has consequences if I'm wrong, because all these years after will be wrong if this year is wrong. So I want to be really accurate with this first year. And I can do that by kind of going through the segments and estimating how much they will grow. So in this case, I estimate GPU to grow by 37%, which is still very high, but lower than the last 2 years. I estimate Tegra to grow by 53%, which is lower than last year, but so it's pretty a moderate measure. And this gives me the 13.5 billion revenue. And so these are very strong numbers, but I think it's doable for Nvidia, and so this is why I get this number. Now I can also go into the quarterly revenue and do it that way. So I can add up all 4 quarters and get a number, which is what I also did. So you can see this trend in the quarterly revenue that quarter 1 and 2 are similar and weaker than quarter 3 and quarter 4. So I took this trend and applied it to the next year. Now Nvidia estimated 2.9 billion in revenue for quarter 1 2019. This says 2018 because Nvidia reports their years 1 year ahead. So they estimated 2.9 bill. Now in that case, if I use the trend that quarter 1 and quarter 2 are weaker than quarter 3 and quarter 4, well, I can kind of extrapolate that and get these 4 quarters of revenue. Then I can estimate, all the small parts. So this is also how I come to this 13.5 billion number. And this 13.5 billion gets me to an earnings per share of 6.58. And this is fairly close to the analyst estimate of 6.28. So I think in this case, I'm just more bullish on their Tegra revenue growth, and I'm also more bullish on them growing their GPU segment. Now, I think their GPU segment is going to grow because the new Volta architecture for the gaming GPU will be released. So that's why I think they'll be doing this well. Now, after that, it's educated guesses, beyond that. So I'm planning for Nvidia to grow, exceptionally well for the next 3 or 4 years before leveling out to more average levels. Now in my model, I don't take into account any decline in growth, which that could be a mistake in this model. I also don't take into account maybe an economic crash. But I can keep in line with gross profit. I can keep it at 59%. I can keep the tax rate at 12%. I can keep operating expense pretty similar to how it's been when revenue grows a lot at 24%. So, if operating expense grows by 24%, but revenue grows by 32%, well, we're going to have more money overall. So that's more growth. And I also made sure to do the revenue segment for this 2019 year. This shows 31% GPU and 37% Tegra growth. So I think those are numbers that are very achievable for Nvidia. And this is much higher than the analyst estimate. So I have earnings per share of 8.79 estimated to be compared to 7.26 for the analyst. So I think I'm just more bullish on GPU still growing by a lot. And I think they'll grow because of this new Volta technology. I think they'll grow because of new games coming out. And I also think they'll grow because their Tegra revenue is going to be doing consistently well over these years. Now, 2020 is when a lot of their partnerships with driverless cars, start coming to reality. So this includes a partnership with Baidu and ZF to make a driverless car platform in China. That's set to release in 2020. And then also a Volkswagen bus with Nvidia AI technology for 2020. So that's what I assume is going to grow their Tegra revenue growth by a lot. And then their GPU growth is going to decline to 20%. Now, beyond that, you can't really forecast, very accurately, I don't think. So these are mostly guesses. Now, I can keep my gross profit margin the same. I can keep tax rate the same. I can keep operating margin kind of similar, maybe a little higher. And I can kind of gauge where I think they'll go from here. But it's hard to predict these accurately just because they're so far ahead in the future. Now, if you know the future cash flows of a company, you can calculate what they're currently worth. And that's exactly what I did. And it's called the discounted cash flow method. So you're basically discounting a future cash flow to a present value. And this discount rate is basically the rate at which a company's future cash flow is at risk. So, a 7% chance that this cash flow is not there. A discount rate that you'd use for the US is like one of their bonds, at 2.8%. That would be their discount rate, because there's a good chance they have good credit, and there's a good chance that they will have money to pay their debt. And so this is basically the interest rate I'm giving Nvidia, 7%, which is a really good interest rate, a really good discount rate. The lower the discount rate, the better it is. Higher discount rate, the more risk there is. And so I gave Nvidia 7% because I think there's going to be a high chance that they're still around in the future and they're still the leader in their market. Now, if you calculate a net present value of these future cash flows that I estimated, then you'll get a present enterprise value, which you can then divide by the shares outstanding to get a price estimate. And my price estimate is $329. So this is a 34% return if you bought it right now. So, what's the problem with this? Why is this might not be accurate? Well, if I got the discount rate incorrect, if I got any of these future cash flows incorrect, if I got the maturity of the business incorrect, and maturity is basically, if Nvidia is still around in 2030, how much are they going to grow by from then on in perpetuity? So I said 1%. But if I get any of these, the cash flow, discount rate, or maturity incorrect or inaccurate, well, then it's going to throw off my calculation and I will get a wrong price. So, it really comes down to what information you're putting into this model. And it takes a lot of work, it takes a lot of time, and takes a lot of experience. So that's what I wanted to do. So you can see a discount rate, which is higher risk, especially for a higher risk company. That would put it at 209, so I'd short it in that case. But I don't think they're a 10% discount rate, just because they're going to be around in the future. Some other, good points. I went into some rival companies and I looked at their gross profit. Nvidia has a gross profit of 60%. Intel has a gross profit of 62%. AMD only has 34%. So, obviously AMD is, lagging behind these big companies. And that's exactly what I wanted to look into as well. So I went to the market share for the GPU. GPU is mostly dominated by AMD and Nvidia, and I compared the two revenues. And you can see that Nvidia has always led, back until 2010, has led, and they keep on leading at like 70% market share for the GPUs. So I think they're going to still be leading in the future. Maybe they won't have as much market share, but I still think they're going to have a lot. So this is going over the model. I can also go into, after I model out everything and see that they are undervalued, in my opinion, I can go and look at more things about the company. And one of those things is the management. Now, the CEO holds 21 million shares, and that is around 5% of the total holdings of the company. So that's very good to see, because this CEO is invested in the company that he co-founded. Now, it's awesome to see. But it's also a risk, because if something happened to him, that would definitely be bad for the company. So I'm just going to go over some other risks that they have. Google is developing their own TPUs. So this is for data scientists, and it basically, is competing with the GPU that Nvidia has for data scientists. So if, Google develops a better one, well, that will not be good for Nvidia. Another risk is of cryptocurrencies dropping. And in that case, a lot of, like Bitcoin miners, they might sell their GPUs. And this is, a lot of people are worried about this risk. I don't think it's that big of a risk, just because the demand will be there to buy those GPUs off the market. So I don't think that's a significant risk. Another risk is, something happens to the CEO. Another risk is if, spending dropped overall. So like if the economy tanked, well, then I don't think a lot of people will spend on the newest technology. So obviously that will decline Nvidia's price. Now, some of the catalysts for Nvidia are, one, this new Volta technology, two, any news around the Switch, selling more units, three, any news in the AI industry for driverless cars. I think that will, bring a lot of speculation into it, but also will show that Nvidia is actively working on to be involved in this market, and I think that's definitely good for their company. So yeah, this is Nvidia. I'm going to leave a link to the drive with this model, and also the paper that goes with it. So yeah, that kind of goes over everything. Thanks for watching. Make sure to check out the drive and also my next video on my portfolio.